Imagine you're reading a police report about a deeply complex global crime. If you're like most people, your immediate instinct is to probably just flip straight to the last page, right? You want to know who the culprit is, how the whole thing got resolved, and you just want to jump straight to the answers. But when you do that, you actually miss something much more subtle and honestly far more important. You forget to ask, well, why did the detective choose to interrogate these specific witnesses in the first place? And why did they completely ignore the others? Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're not just flipping to the end of the report. We're diving into a fascinating essay by Professor Antonio Francisco titled The Archaeology of Underdevelopment, and we are going to apply that exact detective mindset to the study of global economics. Here is the roadmap for our intellectual excavation today. 1. A history of questions. 2. Non-chronological archaeology. 3. The erasure of a word. 4. Capitalism and dependency. And finally, 5. The limits of structure. Let's kick things off with Section 1, a history of questions, and the overarching problem we're dealing with. Usually when we study why some countries are incredibly wealthy and others are trapped in poverty, academics tend to throw these really complex mathematical models and policy theories at us. They kind of just look at the surface, assuming that whatever the newest idea is, it must be the best one. But the core issue here, a massive chunk of the globe locked in structural poverty, that hasn't disappeared. So instead of rushing to the answers of economic development, our source essay challenges us to pause. We need to ask what underlying premises led the economic detectives to look in one specific direction while completely ignoring another. Over the last 70 years or so, development economics hasn't actually just piled up new answers. It has entirely shifted its field of vision. We've moved from asking, how does underdevelopment even arise, to how do we promote development, all the way over to focusing on institutional progress, and finally, corrective capacity. The really crucial point here is that a new question doesn't just replace an old one. It expands the entire horizon. What we're really studying here is the evolution of the questions themselves. To truly wrap our heads around this evolution, we have to rethink time itself. That brings us to Section 2, Non-Chronological Archaeology, Rethinking Time. Standard history relies heavily on a chronological timeline, just putting things in order by date. But our source text argues this linear approach totally fails, simply because it doesn't dig into the hidden premises beneath the official discourse. Instead, we have to look at what's called logical depth. We're going to organize ideas by the foundational bedrock they expose, rather than just the date someone published a paper on a calendar. Now, that can sound a little opaque at first, so let's use an analogy. Imagine you build a city. Chronologically speaking, the physical foundations go in first, and then the buildings go up. But imagine the ground underneath actually has hidden geological faults. We might only bring in seismologists decades after the buildings are finished, right when cracks start appearing in the walls. Those cracks in a modern building force us to study the older foundational soil. In the history of ideas, newer critiques often serve to expose the conceptual bedrock of theories that were established 30 years prior. And when we map out this conceptual archaeology, we see that exact concept in practice. We are excavating the logic of these theories, layer by layer. The absolute deepest layer, layer 7, is historical underdevelopment by Celso Furtado. As we move up structurally, we hit structural dependence, then markets, institutions, and finally corrective capacity. So an idea from the 1980s might actually sit structurally below an idea from the 1970s if it exposes a deeper, more foundational truth. All right, let's grab our trowels and dig into Section 3, the erasure of a word, a rescue mission. Picture this. The year is 1981, and a massive institutional rebranding is taking place. Major international organizations, universities, the World Bank, they're all actively erasing a specific word from their vocabulary. The word underdevelopment is being officially banished, and it's being replaced by shiny, optimistic terms like developing countries. On the surface, it seemed like a totally positive PR move, right? But the Argentine thinker Horacio González saw this, and he didn't see a harmless update. He saw a dangerous intellectual erasure that he felt he had to launch a rescue mission to fight against. To really understand González's outrage here, imagine a hospital administration deciding that the word disease is just too negative, so they ban it. Suddenly, cancer patients are officially referred to as citizens on wellness journeys. The PR sounds fantastic, but the underlying suffering is still exactly the same. There's still no medicine. The violence of reality is simply being hidden beneath a layer of corporate feel-good jargon. González argued that dropping the word underdevelopment was a deliberate sanitization of reality. It was an evasion that masked the very real fact that global poverty and debt were in reality getting worse. So, what was the actual reality González was trying to protect? Let's move to section 4. Capitalism and dependency, the theories. To analyze this vocabulary shift, González used a very specific analytical lens called historical materialism. Now, to be absolutely clear, by exploring this, we aren't endorsing any specific political viewpoint. We are simply unpacking the exact tools he used to argue his case. He firmly believed that the words science uses don't just fall from the sky out of nowhere. They are actively shaped by economic power. To him, the word underdevelopment was banned precisely because it contained an accusation. It implied that the core was rich, specifically because the periphery was kept poor. Which brings us directly to dependency theory. In plain language, this is the idea that the world is structurally divided into a wealthy core and a much poorer periphery, and that resources continuously flow from the poor to the rich. If you remove the word underdevelopment from the conversation, you completely erase this historical tension. You essentially tell the periphery, hey, this is just a plumbing issue. Fix your local deficits and you'll climb the ladder. It completely hides the structural reality of the global system. So González's core thesis really boils down to 3 main ideas. First, underdevelopment is absolutely not just some primitive stage that you eventually grow out of. Second, it is a specific historical product of global capitalism. And third, the center and the periphery produce each other reciprocally. Development and underdevelopment are quite literally 2 sides of the exact same coin. By fighting so hard to keep the word alive, González was fighting to keep this massive systemic question from being swept under the rug. Now, González's framework is undeniably powerful, but it does have a major analytical limit. Let's look at section 5, the limits of structure testing boundaries. If we take González's strict structural determinism and apply it to the real world, it kind of hits a brick wall. Just take the stark comparisons between South and North Korea back in the 1950s. Both shared the exact same grim peripheral constraints. Devastated by war, formerly colonized, basically zero natural resources. Under González's theory, both were entirely doomed by the global structure. And yet their trajectories went in radically opposite directions. You see the exact same thing with Mauritius and Zimbabwe in Africa. Both exited colonialism with extractive, highly dependent economies. Yet Mauritius went on to build a functional democracy and diversified, while Zimbabwe faced chronic collapse, largely due to internal political decisions. This beautifully illustrates the tension in our first archaeological layer. Step 1, González illuminated the origin of dependency brilliantly. But step 2, his theory really struggles to explain why countries with the exact same starting constraints diverge so wildly. The purely structuralist view is a bit like evaluating a ship's journey across the ocean by only looking at the storm. Yes, the storm is real, and yes, it's unfair, but it completely forgets to look at the captain of the boat or the quality of the wood it's built from. Local institutions and human agency matter immensely. Which leads us to step 3. We have to dig deeper to find a new question. Horacio González put up an incredible fight in 1981 to defend the fortress of this concept. But, as our essay notes, he only defended the fortress. He didn't actually build it. To truly understand the bedrock of this idea, we have to move down to layer 2 and return to the original architect himself, Celso Furtado. Before González ever came along, someone had to take the term underdevelopment, which again used to literally just mean primitive, and weaponize it into a deeply disruptive scientific category. Someone had to invent the very idea that the wealth of the center feeds on the periphery. How did Celso Furtado manage to invert the world to create the questions we've been trying to answer for decades? Well, in the spirit of true archaeology, there is always a deeper layer to explore, and that is exactly where we will pick up in our next excavation.